Mach 3, give me crew show on 2, 3, and 4.
Personnel line 1, exit 1.
6, 3. Mach 3, give me start line 2.
5 electric. Mach 3. 5 line, come on up.
Mach 3, give me start line 1 and crew show on 7 and 9.
Line 1, crew show 7 and 9, Mach 3.
Yeah, do something. I hate weapons.
Super Ops, line 3, red ball, avionics.
Super Ops. Line 7 is code 3 for Flickas.
Fuck. Hey, so I started a Patreon because frankly, this stuff's getting expensive. Nothing will change the podcast or the blog if you don't subscribe, but if you want early access to episodes, monthly AMAs, episode shoutouts, voting on podcast topics, and all kinds of 20 Years Done gear, head over to patreon.com/20yearsdone. I want to give a special thanks to Kevin Traud, Travis Barnes, and Robbie Walker for their continued support on Patreon for 20 Years Done. Also, this isn't legal or medical advice. Okay, so today I'm joined by a psychologist that served in the military for quite a while. Her name is Dr. Smith. I knew her while I served on active duty, and we've remained in contact over the years. We were lucky enough to interact with each other through a really good friend of mine. Well, he wasn't a friend at the time. He was my first sergeant at the time, Terry Gerald, at Luke Air Force Base. But I wanted to ask Dr. Smith on to kind of discuss what mental health is like in the military, what works and what doesn't work, kind of, and how that relates to my experiences and probably some of the experiences the listeners have been having. So, Dr. Smith, if you could just kind of give us a brief overview about your background and, you know, your kind of qualifications.
Okay. So you mentioned that I'm a psychologist. I have my PhD in clinical psychology, and I actually, after I finished graduate school, I did my residency with the Air Force. So, which is, it's a nice program for psychologists. So it's a 1-year residency, and then it requires a 3-year payback. And then I did a couple of additional years of active duty, and then I actually worked as a contractor for both the Air Force and the Navy for quite a while.
Wow. And so what are you doing now?
So now I have my own practice.
That's very cool. So it's probably a big difference between being a government psychologist and the restrictions that kind of come with that and being a solo practitioner, right?
Yeah, I would say there's quite a few. Yeah, I would agree with that.
So the reason I had you on today is, you know, obviously I've been kind of spending a lot of time trying to deconstruct ongoing issues in the military related to suicide, and certainly mental health is going to play into that. My primary focus has been on what psychological harms, you know, run with military service, and how could that be affecting these suicide rates. But the other side of that coin is certainly, you know, how are we mitigating it through mental health treatment? And I'm certainly not an expert on that. I'm barely an expert on what it's like to be in the military. It's very specific to my career, my AFSC, and my experiences. But from what I can tell, it mirrors a lot of other people's. But I don't have enough experience in the mental health system besides as a customer to really speak on it. So I have some questions that I imagine some of my listeners have, you know, just very, very broad talking points. But you know, obviously the first thing that kind of comes to mind is, you know, the stigma of mental health professionals having to report military members for things they say that would otherwise be sort of confidential or privileged communication in the civilian sector. So how much in your experience in the military did security clearances, PRP, you know, personnel reliability program for nuclear weapons and stuff like that, how much did that hamstring your ability to kind of treat people for mental health issues?
I think the real hamstring in that case is the fact that many people won't present to mental health at all. I think that's the real big issue, and the one that we should probably get back to. I think it was relatively rare when I had to do something for the military that my patient didn't want, or was detrimental to my patient, or that it eventually hurt their career in some significant way. But I do think a lot of people just don't come in the first place. If you're in the PRP program, you're probably not going to come to mental health unless you're willing to give up PRP. Like, you probably know
Right.
that's going to happen anyway. And pilots are never, ever, ever going to come see mental health. In fact, I really think they fear mental health.
Yep.
So
do you think that fear is founded? I mean, I knew a pilot at a base who was in a severely depressed state, and he eventually had to go DNIF, duties not including flying, which is like a huge issue for a pilot. And it was literally just so he could, I think he was taking some medication, or he was certainly getting treatment. But I wonder how much of it is actual. I agree completely, and I definitely want to unpack the perception of mental health as career impacting, and how that may or may not be accurate. But there's certainly a cooling that we see in the military, a chilling of people wanting to go to mental health because they perceive there will be career impacts.
Yes, I think for certain career fields, we mentioned if you're on DNIF or if you're on PRP or presidential support, that all those designations are probably going to end if you go see mental health. I saw a female pilot once who really was having trouble with insomnia that should have been treatable, really, but it just got so complicated. She had to be on DNIF, and then I really think she was stigmatized within her squadron, and then they didn't want her back. And of course, all those things made her anxious and made it so she wasn't sleeping, and it just was incredibly messy. And that's unfortunate, I think.
What's interesting about that too is it really kind of it creates like an inverse safety issue, because we're saying that if you're on PRP or you're a pilot or you're on the presidential sort of tasking, you are afraid to go to mental health because you're afraid that it's going to impact your ability to do your job, when ironically going to mental health will lead to a better job performance and stability outcome. In reality, like if you're having severe depression that's unmedicated, or not treated through psychotherapy or something like that, to me that seems like that is certainly a more dangerous state to be in, the untreated mental health condition, than one that's treated. And it seems strange to me that the way that we've created these certain statuses in the military, it disincentivizes people to get treatment, which ultimately makes those programs safer.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. When I was in the service, and I apologize because I don't remember the exact numbers, but we used to have a slide that we presented, and it kind of addressed these issues. And gosh, I wish I remember the exact numbers. I apologize, I don't. But the statistics showed that people that came voluntarily to mental health for treatment, and they, typically they'd get better, because most mental health conditions are treatable, and relatively quickly, because we were focused on short-term effective treatment strategies. So they'd improve and they'd get back to work. And in those cases, the chance that it's going to impact your career is minimal. Like, right. I think around 2% or something, incredibly low. And even then, when we're talking about impact on your career, we're maybe talking about there's an assignment down the road that you don't get or something because you have a mental health history. But if you wait until you are so impaired that people begin to notice, and your commander eventually sends you over under a commander directed evaluation because it's gotten that bad, then the chance of a career impact is so much higher. So it's really better to get treatment early and to get better more quickly before it starts to impact your job performance. But unfortunately, the system just doesn't support that somehow. And I'm curious to hear from you, like, kind of what the word on the street is about mental health amongst active duty members.
I'm going to tell you a story that is 100% true and happened to me. And I understand it's fully anecdotal, but it essentially goes against everything you just said. So, okay. Which also means that, there are the standard is not well established across the Air Force. If what you're describing was the norm you experienced, and what I'm about to tell you was my sole experience. So when I was at Holloman in 2016, I was going through a lot of stuff. So first of all, I was geographically separated from my family. They were still in Phoenix, and I was in Alamogordo, so I was 500 miles away, and I was living in a really crummy apartment in the worst apartment complex in town. Money was tight because I was supporting, the dual households plus bills and utilities and all that stuff. So I had that. So I was stressed out from that. So there's some social isolation or just physical isolation as well. And I was also severely stressed out from work because that was in the middle of, I wrote the story at the end of my career. It was smoke doesn't always mean fire. And that was basically me acting as a whistleblower and facing, pretty substantial retaliation, both career-wise and psychologically. I felt like kind of being tormented by leadership, and we all had to pretend like nothing had actually happened. And then it was compounded with a family member had contacted me and told me that he was going to commit suicide on his birthday that was coming up in a month. I found out I was under investigation for a Privacy Act violation. That was the overt retaliation for whistleblowing. So like I had like some serious stressors going on, and I didn't feel like I was being overwhelmed, but I really kind of took stock of everything that was happening. And especially after that family member said they were intending to commit suicide, and they had called me specifically. So it really laid on me like this really heavy burden that I felt like I had to frantically try to find a way to stave off this impending sort of event. So what I did was when I was headed back to Phoenix, I placed a phone. So, and at the time also, so I was actively being tormented by some people in leadership, and I had submitted a volunteer request to go to Korea, and I had an assignment to phase in Korea to be doc chief, and it was like that was going to be the escape from the situation I was in for a bunch of, because if I'm going to be geographically separated, I might as well get family separation pay. I can be out of this leadership environment. I can be over in Korea having a good time. So it was like very much the light at the end of the tunnel for the experiences I was having at Holloman. And on my way back from Phoenix, after I just learned about that family member that was threatening suicide, I called mental health at Holloman. And I just asked them, I asked to make an appointment, and they kind of, said, okay, so what's going on? I gave them a quick rundown. They asked the standard questions. Are you, intending to do anything? No. I was like, look, I feel like I shouldn't be able to handle this, although I am. And I really need to kind of unpack some of this stuff and work through it with somebody. And I made that phone call. I think I made that phone call around Lordsburg, New Mexico, which was maybe 3 or 4 hours out from Holloman, if I remember correctly. And as I was passing Holloman, I got a phone call from assignment saying your assignment's been canceled. And I said, what? Why? They said, well, you made a mental health appointment. I said, I haven't been diagnosed with anything. And I literally I'm just going to do an intake appointment just to talk to somebody. He's like, yeah, but we're not going to send you to Korea. I'm like, I don't understand how you're not going to send me to Korea when there's no diagnosis here. He's like, well, you need to come by my office. You need to pick up this assignment cancellation notice. You need to bring it over to assignments. So what I did was I went to his office, and he had a letter saying, hey, your assignment's canceled. Or it was like a letter to assignments. And they handed it to me like, hey, yeah, you need to take this to assignments. I'm like, you don't take it to assignments? He's like, no. He's like, you do. I'm like, okay. And I put that thing in my fucking glove box, and I never took it over there. It's like, screw you. And then when I went to my first appointment, my therapist really kind of listened. Obviously the primary focus at that time was the family issues. And I really kind of explained what I was thinking, what I was feeling, and what my concerns were. And after, I explained also that my assignment was in jeopardy because of this appointment, which he found to be utterly ridiculous. And at the end, he says, you don't have a diagnosable condition. You are dealing with extreme life stress, and you came here seeking counsel and guidance to help you work through it. That's a perfectly rational and reasonable thing to do. So for me, there was career impacts that I had just flagged in the system as going to mental health. And now it was removing my ability to escape my torment. And ironically, so my assignment ended up getting canceled for other medical reasons. I couldn't seem to overcome some physical issues. I couldn't get cleared. And ironically, the chief that had been tormenting me got short notice orders to the exact same unit I was going to go to. So I really dodged a bullet.
Right.
So it certainly all worked out in the end, because here I sit. But anecdotally, there was an immediate impact for me seeking mental health treatment. And at the time, it was the worst possible outcome that there could possibly be for me. And when I see people comment on social media, like, go to mental health, it's not going to affect your career, I usually pipe up and say it can, because you'll get flagged for something like this.
Okay. So I hear you. And I 100% believe that story, although it's different from my experience, because in my experience, and it's been a while since I was in the service, I guess I should say I haven't worked for the military since 2014. But when I worked for them, nothing got flagged. No, there was no profile. There would have been no change to your assignment, from my understanding, until you were at least seen, and it was determined if you had a diagnosis. And then it is usually up to the provider to decide if this is something that if it results in a profile, then obviously you may not be able to go to Korea.
Right.
So just making an appointment, that really surprises me.
It surprised my provider too. And that goes to my point where I'm not discounting what you're saying. I'm saying that the standard or the process doesn't seem to be vetted across the service or uniform across the service. So what you get is you get inconsistencies in reports, and you'll get people saying, hey, I was a top secret security clearance. I went on SSRIs. I took SSRIs for 6 years or whatever. I had this issues. I never lost my security clearance, and I did perfectly fine. Then you have me that has like legitimate life stress that makes a single appointment and loses an assignment. And we're both speaking factual truths. And what it does is it confuses people, and people are always going to defer to the worst case scenario, which is my scenario in describing this. So part of it has to be, I don't know. I certainly don't know if that particular assignment person or he was the medical clearance person at the hospital element. I don't know if he was just operating well outside the bounds of AFIs. I'm kind of surprised I didn't dig into it, because I'm the type of person that would dig into an AFI and argue somebody into the dirt. I probably didn't have the bandwidth at the time because of, those stressors. But, consistency in how we address mental health stuff, that's really important too, because the one time that we're not operating in good faith and there is a career impact, when it's in this case where it's really needless, you're jeopardizing the trust that everyone has, all service members have, and all mental health providers across the Air Force, because those stories are the ones that are, go viral either, through word of mouth or through social media. And that certainly chills everybody seeking mental health.
I agree with you. Although it sounds like, tell me if I'm wrong, that after you saw the provider, it got cleared up. You were going to be able to go to Korea. Very
much so. But I was also a master sergeant that was a complete asshole. And I went and picked up that letter before the appointment, and I put it in my glove box. And I'm like, fuck this lazy asshole. I'm not going to turn it in. Like, this is the thing that's destroying my hope. But if I was an A1C that didn't know, I very well could have been like, oh, my orders are canceled, and take it right over to assignments, and it would have been processed and would have been the end of it.
And the reality is, you could have lied to your provider. I mean, I know you didn't, but you could have gone in and been like, hey, it's not what they think it is, and I'm really fine, and really minimize what was going on.
And how dangerous is that, right?
Yeah, right.
Considering the stress I was under, if I have to pick between my, and I saw going to Korea as an escape from torment, like what wouldn't I have said,
Right.
So I guess it kind of brings me to, we've been at war for a long time across the services, but also, obviously, my experience is highly focused on ops tempo and aircraft maintenance, and how long we've been sustaining how long we've been sustaining an unsustainable type of ops tempo.
Yes.
And it seems like, mental health resources in the military did not increase, as the stress of the force kind of goes up, it feels like the mental health resources are really divorced. The billets, the qualifications, the continuing education for mental health providers, like that all happens, but it doesn't happen at the same scale or at the same, in line with the stress across the force, it feels like. And I don't know if that's true, but it certainly feels that way.
I wish I knew more about exactly how they do staffing. I think it's based more on the number of people that you're serving than it is based on the stress or the amount of services that they might need. And it's slow to adapt as well, right? So I think they only reassess the staffing maybe once a year. So, you could have, say, 3 new squadrons move into your base, which would increase your personnel a lot, and nothing would change maybe for another year. And even then, now you're talking about, okay, we should get new people on board, and that takes a long time. So I think the staffing is always well behind where it needs to be. And as we've already said, I think it's based on number of personnel and not the demand, which is not how it should be, obviously. Right.
And that's because, how do you quantify the temperature of stress across the force, across it varies by base, it varies by the mission, it varies by the individual resiliency of each particular person. Like, how would mental health be able to predict the mental health needs of you know, a base or across the service? I don't know the answer to that.
You're right. That would be hard to measure. But I am thinking about what you say about ops tempo. I agree. After the war started, I thought that was a huge concern. And I mean, I think that's an area in which personnel doesn't change, even though the demand has increased.
Yep.
So now you're deploying a lot more people. You're flying a lot more sorties. More training is getting done.
Yep.
You still have the exact same number of personnel, and the military's answer is everyone's just going to work a hell of a lot harder.
Yep.
There are no restrictions, right? There isn't overtime. There are no laws. They can work you till you fall down, and they'll just step over you and keep going. I think that's a huge concern.
Yeah, that's pretty much, you know, and I kind of dissected that too in my conversation, I think, with Jim in episode 8, where it's like, you know, while I rail against the psychological harm that I think is cooked into the aircraft maintenance sort of recipe, you know, that I was subjected to, I think part of that is also recognizing that I was a party to it as well, because, you know, you can't function in maintenance unless you are adhering to that playbook, and that playbook causes harm, you know, everywhere. And I think a lot of people don't realize it, and that kind of spares them the guilt of it. But for me, I think I realized it and had to really kind of make peace with myself and understand what happened. And then also going forward, I wasn't going to play by that playbook anymore. And I'm just going to burn everything the fuck down. And that's just the way it's going to be. But, you know, I also wonder about like ADAPT and stuff like that compared to the civilian sector, because, you know, the way we treat substance abuse in the military is so fundamental is not the right word. In my opinion, it seems like we're half-assing it, and we're not even half-assing it well, because any alcohol-related incident all of a sudden becomes a trip to ADAPT. And yes, they can evaluate you, but what, you know, on your physical health assessments, it asks how much you drink. People regularly lie on that because they don't want to get flagged. So what it does is it hides statistics of substance abuse. Certainly substance abuse, you know, runs with trauma, runs with mental health issues of people self-medicating, and certainly relationships issue either feed from that or can cause that. It seems like there's this this culture of interdependency between mental health, substance abuse, ops tempo, overworked, relationship issues, where they're all, once you get into a cycle of it, it's all very much self-feeding. And the solution of ADAPT seems so woefully under-resourced in both, you know, the process, but also in, you know, how people perceive ADAPT, that I don't have any faith in ADAPT personally. And I'm wondering what your kind of take on it, either as somebody that's, you know, sort of familiar with ADAPT, or at least can talk about, you know, your experience with addiction treatment in the civilian sector versus the military.
Well, that's my initial thought. I think that true substance dependence, like true addiction, is incredibly difficult to treat. And I think treatments are ineffective everywhere, if I'm being honest. I mean, both in and outside of the military. And then I think it's incredibly complicated in the military by the fact that that is a case where mental health can be career ending. ADAPT can be career ending. And it's a case where the commander can and does order treatment, where that doesn't happen in kind of a typical mental health setting. And so I think there is a lot of, it's just a very adversarial system. And then I just think substance abuse treatment in general is just not well developed anywhere, not in the civilian sector and not in the military. It's just incredibly difficult to treat.
So, I mean, I had an incident, probably 2009 or 10, I think it was, where I was at an Oktoberfest, and this woman had been groped by a gentleman, and my knee-jerk reaction was I wanted to go over and kind of, you know, put hands on him. Yeah. But I had been drinking, but I hadn't been drinking a lot. And I think it's really interesting that if I had any alcohol in my system and I went over and I put hands on him, what I was just shoving him and getting in his face and telling him, you know, because essentially he sexually assaulted somebody. So it was put hands on him and let him know that that behavior is not okay, and this will escalate if it persists. If I hadn't been drinking, let's say the cops came along and I got arrested or whatever, and I go in front of my commander, I said, look, this dude, sexually assaulted this woman that's a friend of mine, and I put hands on him and let him know that that wasn't okay, and I let him know that it would get worse if he persisted. I think there would be nothing that comes of that at all whatsoever. The commander would be like, hey, I get it. I understand. I probably would have done the same thing. Just, you need to pay attention to what you're doing and maybe find a cop next time. That would be the end of it. But if I had a beer in me or 2 beers in me and my behavior was exactly the same, now it's an alcohol related incident. I have possible career impacts. My performance report might reflect that. There'll be administrative actions that aren't necessarily, up to a judicial standard. We'll get an LOR or UIF from the commander, a referral EPR or something like that. I'll go to ADAP. And I don't know, I never went to the ADAP, so there's a lot of my ignorance shining through here. But I don't know if there are certain triggers for ADAP where if you are violent while you are under the influence of alcohol, is that an automatic trip into the full-blown program instead of just the evaluation? But we try to create these bright line rules or differentiation between when something is an alcohol-related incident and when it's not. And I think it just really kind of involves people in that process that don't necessarily have a problem with addiction or alcohol.
I 100% agree with that. I have seen countless military members that have been referred for an alcohol-related incident where the incident probably had nothing to do with the alcohol. They just happened to have been drinking, but their behavior probably would have been the exact same had they not been drinking. But so what I hear you saying, though, is that you didn't get referred. It didn't get flagged as an alcohol-related
because
incident.
I guess I didn't finish the story. I thought of these things as I was sitting there, and I just didn't go over.
What do you mean? You just didn't go over and talk to them?
Yeah, like I thought, okay, here's the 2 scenarios. If I was sober, if I had a few beers in me, it would have the same outcome. So I was like, I just can't go over there because I've had a beer. So it made me literally not go over. And, obviously it didn't escalate, thankfully. But like, and obviously if I was sober enough to logically walk through these 2 scenarios, to me, that implies I wasn't, influenced by the alcohol. But for the Air Force, it doesn't matter. If you have alcohol in your system, it's almost assumed that it has influenced your judgment no matter what.
So my understanding is, and you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, but if you're flagged for an alcohol-related incident, it results in an automatic referral to ADAPT for an evaluation.
Mm-hmm.
But then once you get to ADAPT, you get the evaluation, and ADAPT can decide if any further treatment is necessary. And I do know from ADAPT that vast majority of alcohol-related incidents don't result in anything more than education. Do you think it's because when people go for that eval, they lie? I do think that's part of it, yes. But I also do think that ADAPT tries to weed out those referrals that aren't really because of the alcohol,
right?
Weren't really related to alcohol. Although that is hard to say. You want to say like, oh, I would have done the exact same thing if I had not been drinking,
mm-hmm.
but you can't know for sure, right? I mean,
right.
Your inhibitions are definitely down when you've been drinking. So
yep.
Maybe you would have done something differently if you had not been drinking.
Sure.
So I feel like ADAPT tries to sort that out. And in my mind, that's preferential to a commander sorting that out, because what I've heard commanders say over and over again is, oh, he's a really good troop. So then it comes down to how good you are at your job or how critical you are at your job. And
mm-hmm.
I do get uncomfortable when we leave too much up to the commanders to sort things out.
Right.
And especially, I'm sure you know this, but if you're a pilot, then nothing would ever get referred.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? Because everyone knows that if it gets referred, then they lose a very valuable body for everything that we do. So nothing gets referred. I
think that's true too, but I also just think it's a good old boys club amongst the pilots.
That's fair.
Yeah.
So
in fact, I had a commander lose it on me because one of his pilots got drunk, and I mean like filthy drunk, and got arrested for public urination, I think. And that's a ADAPT referral. I mean, that's
right.
an alcohol-related incident, and the commander really fought that. He didn't want to have to send his pilot over, but you have to wonder. I mean, I don't think he would have given a second thought if it had been a maintainer.
Are you suggesting there's varying standards for the officer class, the enlisted class, and then secondary standards between flying officers and non-flying officers? That's
I think I
ridiculous.
see more between the flying and not flying, but
Yep.
yeah, I'm suggesting that.
Well, you're probably not going to shock anybody in the audience, so that's fair. So I guess what frustrations did you run into when you were in the military as a mental health provider? I mean, do you have any, like, obviously nothing too specific, but do you have any times you were just thinking like, this is just so dumb?
Oh boy, I'm sure there's a million of them, but why does nothing come immediately to mind?
All right, then, well, I'll let you kind of chew on that for a second. I got another question I want to ask. You know, I'm of the impression that between the VA and the military, that there is a very particular mental health toolbox and skill set that's required to navigate military patients or veteran patients. How easy is it to shore up, you know, the mental health services in the military with civilian counterparts that don't have any interaction with the military? I mean, how well can a purely civilian mental health provider transition into treating service members in their unique situation?
So are you saying, like, if we hired, say, a civilian
Right.
off the street, how long would it take them to?
Yeah.
I think the treatment isn't the issue. As I've said, and I think this isn't always the case, but the military does want what they call short-term, empirically validated treatments, which means they want to get people better and then they want to get them back to work, which is what everyone should want. That should be true in the civilian sector too, although there are some conditions that aren't quick fixes, of course. So I think the issue is less about the treatments, although once you work for the military, they will provide you with some trainings, often free, which are lovely, on, say, the treatment of PTSD or things that you will need to know or will benefit from as a military provider. I think the thing that takes a long time to catch on to is just the military ways, right? The military lingo and how rank works and how much authority the commanders have, and those, how profiles work, all those military constructs, that's what takes a while to learn.
So when I was a very young airman, and I don't think I've told anybody. I've told people. I haven't told any of my listeners or readers this, but I had some pretty significant mental health issues, and it was right when I was a first term airman. I was in probably a pretty highly depressed state. Luckily, I reached out to a friend of mine, Matt Gilliland, who we were in tech school together, and we served. We only served briefly together, but we stayed in contact. And now that we're retirees, we text back and forth and call each other Buck Sergeant and shit. But I had reached out to him, and he was observant enough to know that I was giving up enough warning signs that he contacted, I think, my first sergeant at the time, which was Terry Gerald, who Terry had left. He had left an ALS graduation, and he came over in his mess dress to come see me, and he checked on me, and he made sure that I was taken care of. But I was definitely in a dark place, and I attribute a lot of that to being, I think I was 20 years old, and I had just been in aircraft maintenance for maybe 6 months. But that's such a harsh climate to get introduced to, and the spin up is so the learning curve is so steep, and it takes so much to get spun up. And it's both in the technical aspects of it, but it's also in the cultural aspects of the flight line, where you have to, like, callous over. Like, how I am now as a person, and certainly when I served, is radically different than how I was at 20 years old, struggling with mental health issues, because what I did was I adapted to that culture, the maintenance culture and environment, and I kind of calloused over emotionally, and that's how I survived and thrived. But that's not a healthy way. That's not a healthy way to address it. And I'm curious, as somebody that was, a mental health provider in the military, how often did you see, like, first term airmen as the people that were really struggling with the military compared to, an older established career airmen and stuff?
I think first-term airmen, young airmen, are the bulk of the practice. And But there's a lot of reasons for that, I think.
Right.
I hear what you're saying, but
Mm-hmm.
it's difficult to transition into the military, as you well know. It's a lot of things. You're learning a new job. You're away from home for the first time, and you're probably homesick. You're
Mm-hmm.
trying to make new friends. Like, everything's new.
Right.
And I don't know if you've ever seen, there's a list of, like the top 100 stressors, in life. And the number one is loss of a child.
Yeah.
But when you're a new airman, you probably have like several of those. A new
Right.
job is top 10. Moving away from your home is a top 10. So you just, learning a new career field's got to be up there. You know what I mean? So there's just so many things at once, I think, for a new airman.
And I assume that.
But I also think for a maintainer, I saw a lot of people who were just afraid to do their job because, and I know why the Air Force does this, but they say things like, you're working on a multi-million-dollar aircraft with $1 million pilot, and if you screw up, the world is going to end. And that's scary for a 19-year-old who is well aware that they don't really know what the hell they are doing.
That's fair. I didn't know what the hell I was doing. But talking about those stressors, and I'm sure you're probably the best person for me to ask. I assume that suicide rates or mental health treatment or need for their civilian counterparts between ages 19 and 25 are also probably higher than the national average and stuff, right?
I wish I knew the answer to that. I should know the answer to that. I don't know for sure, but I think it is. Like, I think at colleges, you're getting a lot of 18 to 25-year-olds that are dealing with similar issues. They are struggling to establish an identity. They're maybe having trouble with school. They're drinking and getting into those things for the first time. They're away from home. They're struggling with their social group. So I think there are a lot of similarities between a college campus and young airmen.
Yeah, and that's fair. And kind of how I've differentiated in my mind. So recently, I recommend you watch it too if you want. There's especially with your background. There's a movie called Do No Harm where it talks about. There's a bit of I don't want you to play it down. There's a suicide epidemic going on with medical students and residents because of their ops tempo and the stresses of if you kill you might kill someone, and it really parallels what I saw in aircraft maintenance. I found the movie just absolutely captivating. You can find it on Amazon Prime, but it's not free. But I wonder, the big thing for me is that feels different from the civilian counterparts that are going to college that are experiencing a very similar stressors to young airmen. Is young airmen feel trapped because it feels like there is no way out of the military, because if you don't show up, they can order you. You can go to prison. Although the reality is, like I talked about in episode 11, if you are genuinely depressed, there is a way out of the military. You can go to mental health, you can seek treatment. So, for me, I think it's really important to communicate that you are not trapped. It is not hopeless. And that's the benefit that civilian counterparts have. If they're at college and they're totally stressed out, they can walk away. Yeah, they're going to incur the student loan debt and all that stuff. But the reality is they know they have the option to quit and leave. Where in the military, I think a lot of people feel trapped due to the way the military is constructed, with all the legal sort of ramifications for not doing what you're told.
Yeah, that's 100% true. I was active duty. I came in as an officer. I'd already finished graduate school. And I had overall a good military experience. Of course, some bad things happened to me. I think there were some things that happened to me that were unfair and unjust. Mm-hmm. But overall, when I look back, I think it was a good experience for me, and I don't have any animosity. In fact, I'm glad I did it. But I remember very distinctly a time shortly after I had been commissioned where I was like, I think it was because someone mentioned that somebody on my base, not somebody I knew, but they had gotten a sunburn. Mm-hmm. And that they might be written up for destruction of government property. I'm not kidding. I don't know if that really happens, but that's what they were talking about. And it sank into me that the Air Force owned me.
Yep. Your property.
That I was stuck. Wherever they told me I was going to do or where I was going to go, that was going to happen. So yeah, it's pretty sobering, and it's in theory it when you sign up,
Right.
but that's different from when you first want to leave or you want to do something other than what you're expected to do, and you really realize that you can't.
Yeah, me and Kevin talked about it in I think it was episode 7 when I talked to Kevin Traw about it. He was talking about when you get the call from the government he was going to deploy, and he'd get his mobility bag together, and it would be sitting by the front door, and his wife would come home, and there was all this uncertainty with it. And he's like, I'm going to have to go. And then a day later, it's like, okay, they canceled it. And he drag it back and put it in the closet. And then 2 weeks later, it was back, and it was the uncertainty. And it's really like you get yanked around. And at the time when you're in the military, I mean, it sucks, but you don't understand what that does to your psyche. You always feel like you're just a little bit unstable in everything you're doing, and that goes to, I think I've developed, I've been kind of, meditating on it and thinking about it, but I've kind of realized that I get really frustrated and agitated when I have like spontaneous plan changes and stuff. And part of it, I think, is from, being 20 years in the military. Like, you feel like your time is never your time because, it's a Friday evening and you planned on going to the water park with your family, and you get a phone call that even though you did everything right with the EPR or whatever, the commander's CAT card like screwed up his signature, and they have to reroute it from an old one, and they need you to come back in because this EPR has to be done before the week starts, and you have to drop what you're doing with your family, even though it was no fault of your own. You have to come into work and log in, and it's like, it's an inconvenience that you don't typically see in the civilian sector, but what it does is it's really signaling to you, yeah, you have your personal time, but it's never truly yours. So you really kind of jealously guard it. And then, when you're out of the military, you realize just how much you cling to controlling your time. At least that's what I do. And I suspect that probably a lot of the people listening it's dawning on them as well, if it hasn't already dawned on them, that between lost tools, getting called in for lost tools so you can walk around, or someone gets a DUI and they drag everybody in on a Sunday, like, your time is never your time. And it really reminds you that you don't have control of your life. And for me, that was a very sort of, it affected me way more than I realized.
I couldn't agree with you more. I have already mentioned that I have really serious concerns about the degree to which, in my opinion, the military can and does sometimes abuse that. The plane's broken, we have less planes, we still want to fly the same number of sorties, so everyone's just going to work harder, and whatever you had planned, sorry. Yeah. And I experienced that to a much lesser degree, of course, because I was medical, and I had pretty regular hours. I did have to be on call sometimes, but otherwise I had pretty regular hours that I could count on. But there were times I remember, like, we were mandated to work Saturdays, sometimes for good reasons, things needed to get done, but often for stupid reasons. And I had to cancel plans, and it's very frustrating. And I know that's much truer on the flight line, which in my mind, I consider the real Air Force.
Yeah. Just playing to the audience now. So, I guess, since you have one foot in the Air Force and one foot out kind of deal, you can kind of see both sides. What does the Air Force do for mental health that you think is really good or almost better than the civilian sector? Or what processes or what services do they offer that you almost miss?
Well, one thing I think is really nice about the Air Force, I mean, that mental health it's free. All medical care is free. Yeah. So there's no financial barrier. And it's relatively quick to get in. If you were a civilian wanting to go see a psychologist in my area, you're going to have a hard time even finding anyone that's accepting new patients. And if you need to see a psychiatrist, you're going to wait 2 or 3 months probably for your first appointment. And even as a consumer, when I left the military, which, by the way, the reason I left is because I didn't want them to own like my free time anymore. Yep. That was the biggest reason. So I completely get that. Mm-hmm. But when I first left and I needed to take my daughter to an appointment, I had a hell of a time getting her in to see a doctor when she was sick. And I really missed the military at that point because, I mean, I could have gotten her in.
Yeah, that's fair too.
So
when I've tried to
free and it's accessible.
Yep. And when I've tried to get referrals and stuff, I have to like call each doctor and go, "Do you take this particular health insurance?" Oh no. So I get a list from my doctor. And then she's like, I don't know which one takes your health insurance. You're going to have to call them all and figure out. It's like, oh, this is a giant pain in the ass.
It's a huge headache compared to the military.
So that's something.
Yeah, for sure. And I also think, I mean, the military has a ton of resources. As a military provider, if someone comes into me and their big concern is they've got some sort of financial problem, or they need a car seat for their baby, or, you know what I mean? Whatever it is,
yeah,
that's pretty easily taken care of in the Air Force, truly.
That's fair.
You call the first sergeant and they'll round it up. And good first sergeants. And you mentioned Terry Jarrell, and I agree. He's one of the very, very best.
Yeah, he was.
They do so much for their people. So the resources are good. And yeah, the resources are good. So those are all the things I really miss about military mental health care, that until you become a civilian, you don't really understand that differential. But
fair.
I've already mentioned that the downside is people don't own their lives. They don't own their time. And that can and is abused often in a way that makes people feel devalued.
So I'm going to give kind of a parting thought, and then I'm going to open up to you to give a parting thought as well, because we're almost out of time. Towards the beginning of this conversation, both me and Dr. Smith kind of talked about how, in her experience, going to mental health didn't have career impact. And I had that story where I did have a career impact from going to mental health. But I think it's really, really fucking important to recognize that career impact or not, that's still a better outcome than not going to mental health, living in despair and hopelessness, and then, maybe doing something that is a permanent sort of event. So while I did have a negative experience going to mental health, I'm still glad I did go to mental health, because I would have, like I said, what I was going through at the time felt insurmountable. And I wasn't like in a bad spot, but I think I very well could have been in the coming weeks as it kind of piled on. And if I hadn't gone to mental health and kind of worked through in piecemeal some of the stuff I was going through, it could have had a really bad outcome. So anybody listening, everybody knows that it's better to hurt your career than hurt your family and end your life. So I would encourage anyone listening to this to recognize that, career impact or not, you got to get help. And that's going to be the way you're going to have a better life. Dr. Smith, do you have anything else you want to add before we go?
I do. Well, I guess I want to piggyback on that. From my perspective, the vast majority of people that I saw when I was a military provider that were active duty members experienced no negative impact as a result of coming to mental health. I think the big impediment was just getting away from work for a lot of them, just finding the time to come over. If they were in the real Air Force, if they were on the flight line, that was the hardest thing. The exceptions that I've already mentioned are if you have some sort of special status, top secret clearance, flying duties, PRP, presidential support. If you come under those circumstances, it is going to automatically flag review, and it could jeopardize that status. And you have to decide for yourself if that's worth it. But if you're, like you said, if you're distressed enough or in enough despair, then your life and your personal well-being should be more important than that.
100%.
Situation.
Yeah.
And that's largely been my experience. I will point out one, you have asked about the difference between military and civilian. So in both cases, when I see someone for the first time, I tell them about the limits of confidentiality. And for both of them, it's, if you tell me that, that you're having thoughts of hurting yourself or somebody else, I have to take appropriate action to keep everybody safe. Mm-hmm. And if you tell me that you're aware that a child or a vulnerable adult is being abused, I have to report that. And if you tell me that you're planning to commit a future crime, not a past crime, but a future crime in which somebody might be hurt, I have to report that. Those are all kind of safety issues, keeping people safe. Right. But the difference, the one thing I have to add when I was a military provider that I don't have to add anymore is, and if you tell me something that makes me think you are not going to be able to conduct your job in a safe manner, then I will have to notify your commander. So there's the difference. And that's pretty rare, but that does happen. And that did make being a military provider difficult. I said, and it's true, that 99% of the time, the thing that I was doing was best for my patient. And because it was best for my patient, it was also best for the military.
That's fair.
But there were those occasions that I had to do what was best for the military, and it wasn't what my patient wanted, or it wasn't what they thought was best for them.
Right. Okay, well, I can't thank you enough for joining me. I definitely wanted to explore the mental health side of this, and I think you answered a lot of questions I had and gave a great perspective. I appreciate your time today.
Okay, no problem. It was good to talk to you.
All right, thanks. Adios.
Yep.
That's the show. I can't thank you enough for reading, listening, and watching and supporting everything that I've done with 20 Years Done. If you're new to this podcast, I recommend you go to 20yearsdone.com or find us on Facebook at facebook.com/20yearsdone.